So the question is, what happens to the American banks if Bitcoin becomes the unit of account, the reserve currency? I think that the banks that adopt Bitcoin will do very well, and the banks that don't have Bitcoin on their balance sheet will fail. I believe that, ultimately rational economic actors, if you're a bank, you'd rather lend hard money than soft money, and banks will figure that out. So just like, in many ways, practically speaking, Bitcoin will functionally end, it doesn't end banks, it more so ends central banks, like the Fed and the BOJ and the ECB or the Bank of England. Now, the reality is, if somebody wanted to have a central bank, there's nothing inconsistent with Bitcoin and the idea of a central bank. The key difference is you would just have to capitalize the central bank. Gone will be the times that central banks will be able to create money out of thin air. If people want to have the Fed and tax us and take some of our Bitcoin and put it in the Federal Reserve, we can have a Federal Reserve, but if they lend the money out and they lose it, no takebacks, just like the same applies to all of us. So I think it just depends as to whether or not the bank themselves individually adopts Bitcoin early enough to be able to benefit from it and survive. Short answer of it is 2140 is approximately when the last fraction of a Bitcoin will be mined. I like to think about it like a mortgage. When you start out with a mortgage, it's primarily all interest and a small principal, and then by the time someone pays down a mortgage, it's virtually all principal and a small amount of interest. Bitcoin miners principally do two things. When I talk about Bitcoin being valuable because of a fixed supply of 21 million, you don't get something of value in the world without cost. The cost that secures the Bitcoin network is real-world energy. I talked about that with the mining hash rate. Miners are principally paid in two ways. They are paid in new issued Bitcoin, so 6.25 every 10 minutes currently, that being cut in half in April to 3.125 Bitcoin, in addition to transaction fees. So every time a Bitcoin transaction is set, a small amount of Bitcoin is attached, and that is paid to the miners. So I think about the miners doing two functions. They enforce the fixed supply of 21 million, but they also clear current Bitcoin transactions like the New York Fed clears dollar transactions. In return for those miners transacting and clearing Bitcoin transactions for final settlement, the people who are sending the transactions actually pay Bitcoin miners in Bitcoin, so current holders of the currency. And the way, again, I think about that is that at the end of the day, if the fixed supply of 21 million holds, there's going to be so many people demanding Bitcoin and demanding Bitcoin transactions that just like today, the Bitcoin transactions have a real purchasing power, the fees, more than when 50 Bitcoin were being issued when Bitcoin was just launched, that will continue to hold because as the purchasing power of Bitcoin goes up, the nominal amount of Bitcoin issued goes down, but the real purchasing power of those issued Bitcoin actually continues to go up for the reason that it reinforces scarcity. So short answer is 2140. Longer answer is transaction fees will replace the value that's paid via issued Bitcoin, and that what really matters is the real purchasing power of the Bitcoin being paid to miners, but there will always be an incentive to secure the Bitcoin network, both for clearing transactions as well as ensuring that there will only ever be 21 million. It's competition. There's a fixed, without getting into too much details, just as there's scarcity in the supply of Bitcoin, there's scarcity in the amount of data that the Bitcoin network can process in a valid Bitcoin block. That scarcity of kind of data processing creates a bidding up of kind of the finite digital real estate. That is what ensures that there will always be a market for fees. Yeah, so I agree with you. I think the sentiment is perfectly right that the Fed and the Treasury are not going down quietly. And it's also not a position of one of hubris. It's recognizing that that's not a good reality. But I go back to a few markers of kind of playing out my thought process. It's that every currency that's hyperinflated, there's been 50 to 60 instances of government currencies hyperinflating. Each one of those was in the same position that the Fed and the Bank of Japan and the Bank of England are in. That basically a central bank can control the supply of its currency, but they can't make people value it. And if they abuse the power of printing money, the currency fails for reasons that it degrades and can't coordinate trade. And so from my perspective, I recognize that there might be some fight. And I'll walk you through what I think actually happens. A fight, not in a kinetic sense, but in a fight of like the Fed and the Treasury coming down harder on Bitcoin. Now, my logic, the way I apply it is they only do that if it becomes more and more apparent that Bitcoin is a threat. If Bitcoin is a threat, it's only a threat because the fixed supply has held. And a rational economic actor would rather be in the position of having owned the asset that preserved purchasing power to then have a future decision point than to have made the decision long ago by not owning Bitcoin. Now, what I think actually happens is that the US government ultimately figures out that it needs Bitcoin too. And that every government figures that out. And that they're actually going to have to own Bitcoin, and that the way they're going to do that is through some sort of acceleration of unquote unrealized capital gains, where they're going to walk up and they're going to say, hey, you guys owe us 30 to 40% of your Bitcoin, and we're going to recapitalize the US government and the US Treasury. Because a currency failing for the reason that they printed too much of it and it starts to fail to coordinate trade, they can't stop that just like any other country that's come before them. You know, equally as powerful countries or empires. And so I agree with the sentiment. I think that there's going to be then they fight you, but then there's always going to be a perspective of rationality, because the government to fund a military, to fund Social Security, they're going to need a working form of money too. And that when the US government banned private ownership of gold in 1933, gold didn't cease to exist. They just then devalued dollars. The people who had gold were had a decision point. Do they hand it in or do they not? And then similarly, when the government tried to ban booze, again, something that people demand because it has fundamental value will continue to exist in the world. What I put forward with Bitcoin is that it's 10 to 100x harder to stop than something like gold or to ban, and it's 1,000x times more valuable to humanity than booze, and people will find a way to use that. And the most likely scenario is that the government recognizes that they need it too, and that they kind of seize it in a way by accelerating taxes. But even in that world, you'd rather own Bitcoin than not. I think I will say that. I think like moral imperative from like helping people, like I think is like close to the vest. My friends and family first, my extended network, because, and I'll get to there, because Bitcoin is going to be a good, and probably the only good that can lift billions of people out of poverty, because sound money is what is required to build civilization and build trade and make trade more sophisticated. And so if you are somebody living, and that is an important recognition, that 2/3 of the people in the world, 3/4 of the people in the world don't have a form of money that can allow them to participate in an economy where they have an incentive to consume less than they produce. Bitcoin is inherently a store of value. It will work as a store of value for anyone. I think there's something kind of comical where like Bill Gates is out there in Africa trying to build toilets, but they don't have reliable power. Bitcoin will provide a currency that will allow for people in impoverished places to develop energy resources and have a currency that when they trade to allow it to store. So that is true, and Bitcoin will be a great good in the world. But money serves to store value. I like to think about it as the developed world has the greatest incentive because they have the most to lose. They have the most wealth to lose. That is what money does. It helps store wealth and it helps us carry forward. People in the developing world probably have the most to gain because they've never had a form of money that has the properties that Bitcoin does, and that finite scarcity works just as well for Paul Tudor Jones in New York as somebody in one of the poorest countries in the Western Hemisphere like Nicaragua. So that is true. It's just like each individual has to act in their own self-interest. That's where we get to the better side of money printing. Yeah, I really think it's a fooled by randomness. I think that the number of people that own Bitcoin and understand it is far smaller than that number. The embedded number of people that view gold as a flight to safety today is actually much higher. So I think it is rational. I think that the reality of the situation is, and I've experienced this personally just because I go out and I talk to a lot of people that are similar to you of having bought Bitcoin, where there are probably certain people in the world that figured out Bitcoin because of what's happening, combination of the Middle East and Russia. Partly because they figure out that, wait, we're just going to allocate another $100 billion to the war complex. How does that make sense? Or when Russia got cut off from SWIFT. But it's not necessarily, it's like in a mass way, it's not possible for singular events to speak to, 90% of people except for hyperinflation. So I think that it's more idiosyncratic, like gold is a more traditional, quote, flight to safety, so it acting as that. But the distinction between gold and Bitcoin is the people that are buying gold really are just buying dollar instruments. They're trading gold to get more dollars, and it's generally financial speculation. What I put forward is that person that figures out that Bitcoin is the solution to inflation, they're not just trading Bitcoin to get more dollars. They're holding it and accumulating it for that end state. So anytime that somebody learns about Bitcoin or maybe something fundamental about it, they had to start their journey somewhere back in time in order to connect a world event to Bitcoin. And so just recognizing that still so few people get it because it's hard to understand, gold is owned by far more people in far more places, and it's a $10 trillion asset class. To believe that more people can, on the drop of a hat, click a button and go buy that thing, that makes sense to me. Over time, what I put forward is that more people will figure out that they're not just trading Bitcoin, even if many people do, to get more dollars, that at the end of the day, they're not going to have to part with their Bitcoin to get dollar exposure. They're going to be able to convert it directly for a home, a car, gas, healthcare, and you can't do that with gold. Yeah, I mean, I think that is logical and inevitable that they get to that end state. I think that many countries that are in that position are connecting these dots now. Pulling the trigger on it, harder to say, but there is also a recognition that I have, because I was like, oh, people are going to figure it out super quickly. And I might just be rationalizing, but I'm just going to tell you my thought process. It's that, the Chinese Communist Party, and though the people who run the Chinese Communist Party, they probably are getting Bitcoin themselves. They don't want Bitcoin to be the thing running their currency. They'd almost prefer the dollar because they want control. So it's very logical that a communist or totalitarian regime would not want their people working with a currency that they as the government can't control. They would, like in this instance, like Russia might prefer the Chinese currency to Bitcoin because they don't want their people not under their control, if that makes sense. Now, they as a country might be mining Bitcoin right now, and as an oligarchy might be accumulating it, but they might not want to send a signal to the world, oh, we're shifting over to a Bitcoin standard, because then they lose all control. But I think it's more likely that countries like the UAE, I brought it up as an example of the UAE and Abu Dhabi specifically, started mining Bitcoin. They're converting their power and electricity directly to Bitcoin. Well, they just announced that they're starting to take rupees, Indian rupees, for oil. Now, a country or city-state, however you want to describe it, like the UAE, there's someone that's very likely to say to India sometime in the next 5 years, hey, how about you just pay us for that oil in Bitcoin? Because they've already come out and said, we don't actually want the rupees. So when they have these dilemmas, people figure it out, and it's kind of like they're in a straitjacket, realizing that they need another alternative, they will come to Bitcoin, but the bigger ones will struggle to do that because they lose control themselves as a result of it as well. Yeah, I think about it as like, I always like to tell stories that I can personally relate to. Nicaragua is the second poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, behind Haiti, right? So when I think about myself going down to Nicaragua, and there's a cab driver, and the per capita GDP in Nicaragua is like $600 a year. But if they're delivering value in current state, and I could either pay that person with a Nicaraguan Cordoba, they'd rather have dollars, but their local currency is their alternative. The question is, what's going to store value over time? And it doesn't make it magically easy to adopt Bitcoin in a world that has economic hardship, because the biggest thing about economic hardship, if you think about something like Venezuela, they're focusing on where their next meal is going to come from, not sitting around a beautiful debate chamber like this, wondering whether or not Bitcoin is or isn't going to replace the dollar as money and the euro or yen. But at the same time, in order for those people to kind of rise up from their bootstraps and get out of poverty, there's only one way. It's by trading, storing money in a form of currency that holds its value over time. What that allows is for this positive feedback loop to say, I can produce something from somebody else, for somebody else. I can consume less than that, and I can preserve my purchasing power into the future. A Bitcoin is going to do that just the same in Nicaragua as it is in the United States. And it's going to do that a lot better than the Nicaraguan Cordoba. So it doesn't matter if that's $5 a day. They're living in a world where they're living off $5 a day. So the question is that $5 going to be preserved into the future better? And is there any way around that being the solution to elevating people out of poverty? Having a currency that can facilitate and coordinate trade better, and then society benefits from people storing value, having an incentive to produce value rather than consume value from people, and develop economies that have trade and specialization. Yeah, and I agree with you. I look at money as a tool to facilitate trade, drive productivity to accumulate capital. Basically, money is the good that helps us coordinate trade to build physical things that we consume in our daily lives and get power, clean water, healthcare. That's capital. So I think we think about things very similarly. I think the signs to demonstrate that knowledge is distributing, there's a few markers. I kind of shared with them on the slide, but the expansion of Bitcoin mining in more and more places and growing, that's a signal because, and I look to that one because it's easy to buy Bitcoin, truthfully. It's easy to buy Bitcoin and turn around tomorrow and sell it. But if you are going to build a 500 megawatt project like the UAE, you have to know something more about Bitcoin that merits you investing several $billion over a 12 to 24 month time horizon to then only be paid in Bitcoin as your reward for making that capital investment. So that's why I don't look just at a vanity metric. It's that the signal of if you are going to pursue that activity, you have to have more knowledge than the average person in the market. On the Lightning side of transactions, that's my signal that says, I don't know necessarily what everybody's spending their Bitcoin on, but I know that they're spending it. Because the Lightning Network is specifically a layer to facilitate smaller, more day-to-day forms of transactions. The other side is price, really. And I make this kind of connection for people that when a Bitcoin is sold for $1, the exact same number of Bitcoin in dollars exist. And so while I talk about the fact that all value derives from the fact that there will only ever be 21 million, and it's solving the problem of they're going to have to print tens of trillions of dollars to be able to sustain the credit system, and that's why Bitcoin exists, that when $1 for Bitcoin secondary market trade happens, it's important to recognize that that transaction has nothing to do, like does not impact the supply of Bitcoin, does not impact the supply of dollars. The market is sending a signal that I'm willing to take fewer dollars for, part with more dollars for a smaller unit of the currency of Bitcoin. That's what the price of Bitcoin going up over time, and that if more people over time sold Bitcoin than bought it, Bitcoin would not go up in value. That the input is the monetary property, the output is price. Now, more to the point functionally of what we're seeing in the market of using Bitcoin as a more of a day-to-day currency, I still think that's a long way off. People are starting to use it, but they're still using it as a store of value. They're still saving in their fiat currency and using the fiat currency as a rail. But at the same time, what we're seeing is, and what I think will fundamentally happen is, merchants will drive Bitcoin adoption. They will principally drive it in places where they have less access to a reserve currency like the dollar, euro, or yen. But then they will do it out of necessity. They'll say, like, I'm feeling, think about Argentina. You know, I was talking to a US public company who has customers in Argentina. They're taking local currency risks. They have local working capital. They need local currency to satisfy that working capital, but they want to get Bitcoin on the balance sheet. It's a more efficient way to get paid and to get Bitcoin on the balance sheet if they do that. So short answer is, it's like, this is going to not be an easy process, you know, but if Bitcoin stores value over time, merchants that are selling their goods and services for the same reason that they would want to convert dollars for Bitcoin will make that decision to say, I need to accept Bitcoin as a direct form of commerce because, you know, and I thought about this, it's what's dictating me working on Bitcoin payments now. It's like, when I woke up and Silicon Valley Bank failed and they had 160 billion of deposits, that is not just a balance sheet problem for those businesses. Those businesses were thinking about, how am I going to receive payroll or make payroll on Monday, but also, how do I receive my revenue if I have this bank as a potential source of failure? So it all starts with the balance sheet decision of, first I have to know why Bitcoin stores value, then I very logically start to incorporate that. You know, as an example, this is kind of more of a vanity thing, but I pay my local rancher in Bitcoin for beef, and he holds it. You know, like, I can't tell you rhyme or reason why he figured it out and why my gas station hasn't figured it out, but the gas station's going to figure it out too. You know, we do have a healthcare provider in Austin that sells a primary care for Bitcoin. It really just comes down to, once you figure out why Bitcoin stores value, you would prefer, if you had customers willing to pay you in Bitcoin, to pay you in Bitcoin. I do think that it's a source of friction, no way around it. But just like people, as we can observe today, are spending their Bitcoin, it's like, would more people be spending their Bitcoin if not for this capital gain issue? Yes, in my opinion. But there are also services, as an example, where I can spend my dollars and someone can receive Bitcoin and a company takes care of all of that tax problem. So I do agree with you. It is a source of friction. There's bills being worked on in Congress to basically create a de minimis exception, which is $600. Again, I don't think that that necessarily gets passed, but all of these things follow from, like, if Bitcoin didn't work and there wasn't demand for these things, then we wouldn't even be having a conversation. And I agree with you, there is that inherent source of friction, but people will adopt it as necessity, and then the rules and regulations will adopt or revolve or evolve around. Like, at some point in my view, Bitcoin will be legal tender in the United States. Now, it's not just going to happen tomorrow, the next day, a year from now, or 2 years from now, but if people adopt Bitcoin for the reason that it stores value, more and more people will do that, and policy will start to adapt to it, not because they're willing, but because there's sufficient demand. And I'm just trying to explain why that sufficient demand will be created despite the friction. I think that there's a recognition from my side that understanding Bitcoin is a very personal thing, that each person has to understand Bitcoin. So it's very logical that it's harder to get a board of 5 people on the same page to say, yes, we want to do something. If that board was 15 people, it's harder to gain consensus, because if I was thinking about that board of people. Well, I've got to at least get 8 people to understand this thing that's very difficult to understand in order for that to happen. So where I think adoption will come from more logically is not just the retail side, but the family office side. Places that have fewer consolidated decision makers, because gaining consensus amongst a broader set of people is inherently harder if you start from the building block that each person has to figure out why that would be a good idea. So I don't necessarily think that the next wave of, kind of adoption necessarily comes from the endowments or the pensions, even though I've seen that certain pension funds have. I think that those are fewer and far between. I think that when MicroStrategy bought Bitcoin as a public company, and then Square followed, and then Tesla followed. Well, Tesla since sold. Elon Musk has demonstrated, again, not in an insulting way, but that he does not understand Bitcoin. He's made comments about Bitcoin block times and transaction capacity that signal a lack of understanding. They bought it and then they sold it. They sold it at a loss. Bitcoin didn't do them any good, maybe did them a lot of pain. So where there are large pools of capital that can make decisions without needing consensus of 10 to 15 people, I think is logically where it happens. That comes to family offices, privately held corporations, tightly held institutions, possibly. But there's no going around these type of conversations. So it would be like if you could imagine yourself forming an opinion, but recognizing that your peers sitting on a board are not anywhere close to you, it's probably not even, if it was a 15-person board, it probably isn't 8 out of 15. It's probably 13 out of 15. So there's a very hard challenge. Now, in the case of MicroStrategy, they got their board together and they went down the rabbit hole. It's not to say that boards can't. It's just to say that there has to be very intentionality to think that a consensus of, 8 out of 10 people or 13 out of 15 people are going to get there, unless there's a lightning rod that kind of, really drives people to go down the path deeply. So I don't think it's happening soon. I think it's going to be the family offices and the private corporations. Yeah, so one of kind of the growing recent trends has been AI, and that I'm somebody who hasn't, I'm kind of bread and butter, like let's help people understand the balance sheet. But it is a good question because, really, when you think about the fiat system, it's an entirely a trust-based system. It's not just a debt-based system. It's trust-based in the sense of like, if I'm going to authorize a transaction, I need to first ping the financial institution. Does that person have the money that they wish to send? And there's a lot of cost associated with all that counterparty risk there, both in terms of the risk of chargeback, whatever it might be. And it, functionally speaking, just makes small transactions harder and harder given the cost inherent in that system. So with something like Bitcoin, it's perfectly set up to be able to process automated payments that might facilitate something like a machine-to-machine or sending API calls, paying for API calls for APIs, for the reason that you can make trustless payments in Bitcoin via the Lightning Network, that it flips the script of, rather than being a trust-based system for payments where I'm looking to a financial institution to say, yes, this person has the transaction or not, if I own Bitcoin and I have the private key to it, or if I'm a machine that's owned by a corporation and I program a set of rules, that machine, based on a current set of software conditions being met, can create a Bitcoin transaction with a private key and authorize it. So really the distinction is Bitcoin payments can happen in a trustless way, basically equity-based rather than credit-based. And for that reason, it does open up a host of transactions that would otherwise be potentially limited for the need of trust. One that I'm particularly interested in is energy, the ability to potentially pay for power. Counterparty risk is a huge problem in the power markets of basically bonds and 30-day holds. Like the fragility in the power markets is probably one just as much of delivering reliable power as it is counterparties that could fail. And so the idea that like, I would probably say like where I see a more like realistic use case sooner being like Bitcoin miners paying these power companies directly in Bitcoin for power in a way that, you know, eliminates counterparty risk and gets the counterparty paid far faster. So I think energy per Bitcoin, particularly in the context of power, will be a particularly interesting one of those use cases. Yeah, so this is a great opportunity. Thank you for like, so I like to lay out, because I've said some like grandiose things. And one of them is that if Bitcoin credibly enforces the fixed supply of 21 million, that it will replace the dollar, the euro, and the yen as a reserve currency. And that's a big statement. I also maintain the view that if Bitcoin can't credibly enforce the fixed supply of 21 million, that it won't. That it won't become the reserve currency, that is both very binary, and to focus people on that critical point. Now, to answer your question, because it's related, of the multiple currencies, my perspective as to why Bitcoin cannot be replaced is for the fundamental reason, I mentioned this at the start, that my thinking around this revolves around the fact that economic systems converge on a single form of money due to the nature of trade. I have to have the form of money you're willing to accept, and you have to accept the form of money that I have, and we are objectively evaluating different goods in the market, and I put forward that the most important property is that it can't be printed. So if economic systems do converge on a single form of money, and I point to the idea that the world previously converged on gold as a form of money. People don't have to understand gold, but they have to accept that the gold standard exists. The world did converge on a single form of money. And that each individual in their daily lives, 99.9% of all individuals and corporations only transact in one form of money. And the questions are why, and is it by coincidence? Why did the world previously converge on gold? And why does everybody only use one form of money in their daily basis, their daily lives? And just because we're transitioning to Bitcoin and using two currencies for a transitionary period of time doesn't mean that those economic facts exist for a reason. And when I think about us having to have a consensus, you or I, well, you're thinking about what is the next person going to accept, because it's an intersubjective problem of trade. Not only are we trading, but you're thinking about your next trade and your next trade. And the identical economic problem exists to all 8 billion people in the world if they could all opt into this form of money that can't be printed. Now, to jump to the end is like, well, what would cause me to change my opinion? Well, of course, if it weren't possible for Bitcoin to credibly enforce a fixed supply, and the key word being credibly. So then the question is, well, what could cause me to think that that is compromised? My marker in the ground that everyone could hold me honest on is that if it were possible to censor a single Bitcoin transaction, then everything is in doubt. And what is the most likely scenario in that? That is the US government saying it is illegal to mine Bitcoin, or if they say it's illegal to mine a transaction originating for this address. Like today, as an example, there's a certain number of Bitcoin addresses that are sanctioned by OFAC, okay? If the US government came out and said, it is illegal, it already is, but if you mine it, we're gonna prosecute you under the Espionage Act or, foreign corrupt actors, whatever you wanna do. If a US-based mine or the Bitcoin network period did not mine that transaction, Bitcoin's fixed supply of 21 million is at risk. The only way that Bitcoin is viable is that it's trustless. If a government could, what I would consider an exogenous force, could start to determine what is and isn't a valid Bitcoin, because there's a certain set of rules that say in the Bitcoin network that are native to the Bitcoin network, this is or isn't a Bitcoin. One of them is that it has to be consistent with the fixed supply of 21 million. Other one is that it can't have previously been spent. There are other rules, but from an economic perspective, those are the most consequential. If those rules were not the only thing that dictated what was and wasn't a Bitcoin, but a US government saying, hey, that Bitcoin is invalid, it would demonstrate that Bitcoin as a network is not sufficiently decentralized to be resistant to censorship. And if it's sufficiently centralized such that an exogenous force could dictate the rules, then if it were possible to censor a single transaction, it becomes a very slippery slope down to if they could change one rule or invalidate one rule, all rules become at risk. And it becomes at risk because of a function of centralization. So, my perspective is economic systems converge on a single form of money. They will converge on the form of money that simply can't be printed because Bitcoin is global and permissionless. It obsoletes the need for a second currency. And that Bitcoin is sufficiently decentralized, in my perspective, to resist all forms of censorship. If the U.S. government, I wouldn't be the champion for, kiddie porn on Bitcoin or, terrorist states using Bitcoin, but all of us having a form of money that works and not being exposed to the negative asymmetry of a hyperinflationary event is worth all of us having the benefit. People use the internet for crimes every day, right? They use the Crimes for Terrorists Act every day. There's nothing inherently criminal about the internet. Same thing about Bitcoin. But that is how I would think about it. If one single Bitcoin transaction could be censored at the protocol level, that does not mean if PayPal is helping somebody use Bitcoin and they censor that person. That's not censorship at the Bitcoin protocol level. At the mining level, if it were possible to censor, then all bets are off. Now, I also think that if that were to happen, the whole world doesn't share that consensus view, so Bitcoin doesn't just collapse on its own weight. But that's what I would be looking for to cause me to question my thesis on Bitcoin. So I think in practice, there's two things. They need a form of money that works as well, and if they were investing in mining infrastructure, they can either two things. They can undermine their own infrastructure, their own capital. So my short answer is no, and the reason for economic incentives. If there's $20 billion and currently Square's working on a mining chip and they're a US-based company, and Samsung's working in Taylor, Texas on a chip fab for Bitcoin mining, and Intel's working on it, that in practice, being able to accumulate all of the power resources necessary to, because it's not just like having 51%, it's being, but it's also this recognition of like, well, you could also just be honest and get Bitcoin, because, the question would be, well, why wouldn't the CCP just mine Bitcoin for themselves, and say, screw off all the people in China, but we're going to take the Bitcoin, because ultimately they don't want the ruble, they don't want the dollar. They're going to use the form of money that works, and if it's Bitcoin, they're not going to invest a bunch of infrastructure to build mining equipment and have all these resources only to then undermine the economic value that they could derive from it. They'd be much more selfishly interested in not allowing their citizens to mine the Bitcoin, but them to start accumulating Bitcoin just like they're accumulating gold, right? They're accumulating gold because they recognize that they need hard money. They have their citizens using their RMB, but that doesn't prevent them from being a rational economic actor. So I think that his perspective on, Elon Musk made a comment about the 10-minute block times being too long. There's a reason mathematically, cryptographically, as to why Bitcoin settled on 10-minute block times. There was nothing magical about 9.5 minutes versus 10.5, but the reason why it was spaced out with 10 minutes was to ensure that if multiple miners solve a block at the same time and distribute it to the network, that happens probabilistically on a rare enough occasion that it doesn't impede people's ability to mine. So that he never communicated, from his own perspective, an explanation as to why his position considered that fact, that people kind of had well known why Bitcoin had chosen the 10-minute block time. So had he said, I understand that it's because there's this probabilistic problem of Bitcoin blocks being solved, because it happens, I think, probably on average once every 2 weeks, where miners solve blocks at the exact same time and distribute valid Bitcoin blocks, and only one of them gets to be valid. So what happens is one miner loses out. You can't have that happen too frequently enough, otherwise people are constantly doing work and not being compensated for it. So if you start from that point of it happens once every 2 weeks, and we're talking about if they solve a Bitcoin block that's roughly $125,000 of economic value, if that happened on occasion more frequently than once every, pick your day. If it happens once a day, is it untenable? If it happens once every other day, is it untenable? Bitcoin, as a security design decision, chose it in such a way that the network wouldn't have to constantly reorg. So that was the origin. He didn't communicate an understanding of that. It was like, well, if I can't have final settlement for 10 minutes, that's too long. It's like, we all know that. We understand that. Why does it exist? So his failure to communicate that was a reason. The other side is on the Bitcoin payment side, with the Lightning Network, I could have 1 million transactions in a Bitcoin Lightning channel without ever having to pay an on-chain fee, except for when I want to receive final settlement. So if I'm thinking about a future world of, say, a Starbucks receiving $5 payments, I could take $5 payments all day long, 100,000 of them across my network, and then close a Lightning channel and have one settlement transaction. So I could have millions of dollars and millions of Bitcoin transactions that are only settled for final settlement once periodically, where I'm not paying a Bitcoin on-chain transaction fee for every transaction of economic value. The way that Bitcoin works, every node stores every transaction that ever exists in the network. At a certain point, it doesn't become viable from a data security, data storage perspective to have every last person in the world storing every last transaction in the world. The way the Bitcoin network, or at least the way a lot of us think about it, another solution could come along that's not the Lightning Network, but the odds-on favorite for how Bitcoin scales is this idea of payment channels where you can have one-to-many, many economic transactions with one final settlement transaction, whether that's 1 to 1,000, 1 to 100,000. I'm very confident that if Bitcoin's fixed supply holds, that if there's 10x the number of people thinking about Bitcoin and solving problems, or 100x, they're going to solve those scaling problems. But even today, we've already created a solution so that people aren't paying high fees per single transaction. Reality is there still are not enough, I'd say, merchant transactions to sustainably have high fees as it is. So people could pay on-chain. If I'm sending somebody, paying somebody a $5,000 bill, say for contract services like a lawyer, I'll pay a 50-cent transaction to have final settlement. But if that answers your question. One of the things is, it's like helping people understand Bitcoin is something that, one, I find rewarding, two, I view it as a moral imperative, and that if there is a call to action, it is that now's the time to be doing the work. I am a small shareholder in a company called Unchained, that if you decided that you wanted to hold Bitcoin, I would recommend that you do it through them. But that now's the time to lock in and to understand this, because the Bitcoin halving event is 6 months from now. The best day since yesterday to understand Bitcoin is today. And from my own perspective, when I help people turn the light bulb on to Bitcoin, there's not a lot more rewarding than that. And so I work on Bitcoin. I've got a book, you can buy it, if you want, to go further down the rabbit hole. But no, it's just I go on podcasts, help people understand Bitcoin. I lived in Dallas for a long time. I consider this my home away from home. I'm in Austin, so just here helping people, figure out sound money. So thank you. Appreciate it.